Welcome to the bedtime sleepy history. Dim your lights, let the day drift away, and gently close your eyes. Breathe slowly, and allow yourself to slip into a world long forgotten, where muddy roads twisted through quiet villages, and smoke curled from tired chimneys into the cold night air. Tonight, we journey not through castles or courts, but these are forgotten hands of history. The gong farmers, the rat catchers, the bell ringers and bone sifters, men and women who labored in silence, often in filth, often alone. Their jobs were harsh, their lives harder still, and yet they endured. So let your mind grow still, your breath grow soft, and step gently into their world. And with that, let us begin. In the darkest stretch of night, when even the roosters had yet to stir and the hearts of townhouses still glowed faintly from dying coals, a man stepped quietly through narrow alleyways, his boots squelching softly in the muck of the streets. Wrapped in a heavy, stained cloak that hung like wet burlap from his hunched shoulders, he moved slowly but with purpose, carried with him a long-handled shovel, 2 wooden pails, and the weight of a job no one else dared to do. He was not a priest nor a merchant, not a knight nor a scholar. He was something else entirely. He was a gong farmer, a man paid to enter the very bowels of the town and remove, by hand, the human waste that accumulated day after day in the privy pits that lined the backs of houses and inns. Though his name might be forgotten and his face avoided in the marketplace, his task was indispensable to the fragile order of medieval life. For in a world where running water did not exist and sanitation was a whispered dream, the threat of disease loomed constantly. And so, while others slept under warm blankets and dreamed of saints or silver, the gong farmer crept into the shadows with his tools, bound for the pits that groaned under the weight of unspoken filth. The term gong did not come from any bell, though the name may have misled those unfamiliar with its grim etymology. It derived from the old word for dung, a crude and ancient term for the refuse of the human body. And the gong farmer, by extension, was one who farmed waste, not in the sense of cultivation, but in the raw, practical labor of extraction. His work was done not for pride, nor for praise, but because it needed doing, and there were precious few willing to do it. He worked beneath the moon, because the law demanded it. The townspeople could not bear to see the labor being done, nor smell it under bright scrutiny of daylight. The very sight of the act was offensive to the eye, a reminder of what civilization tried desperately to forget, that beneath the stone walls and stained glass windows, there was waste ever accumulating, ever pressing outward. So the gong farmer toiled in darkness, invisible by choice and necessity, like a phantom of filth that visited only when the world looked away. Reaching the first cesspit of the night, he set down his pails and pulled the wooden cover away. A warm, sickly vapor rose to meet him, and though his nose had long since dulled to the smell, the sting of it still found his eyes. The pit was full. He could tell from the way the wooden plank covering sagged in the center, how the bricks around the opening were slick with overflow. Kneeling, he unrolled a rope ladder and began the slow descent, boots first, arms steady, breath shallow. The inside of the pit was hot, despite the cold outside. The waste beneath him shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Black, brown, gray, a mixture of everything the town had expelled over the past season. Down he went, until his boots sank into the sludge with a sound like a slow sigh. He reached for his shovel, which had been lowered by his assistant. A boy of 10, paid in copper to help and told never to speak of what he saw. The man began to scoop, methodically, rhythmically. One scoop into the pail, then another, then another. The pail, when full, was hauled up by rope, emptied into a larger container, and lowered again. The process repeated until the pit was half empty, or until the man could no longer lift his arms. Sometimes he worked alone. Sometimes he had a helper above. Always, the work was quiet, steady, and brutal in its repetition. The walls of the pit sweated. The air was heavy, and each movement cost him more than the one before. His muscles ached constantly, not from exertion, but from the cold damp that seeped into them and refused to leave. His skin was red and cracked. His hands, though gloved in thick leather, were always raw from abrasion and soaked in a dampness that never fully dried. He had long since stopped worrying about what splashed on his boots or stained his sleeves. The stink would follow him no matter what he wore. No soap could cut it. No stream could rinse it away completely. It was a part of him, as much as his bones or his breath. When the final pail was raised and the rope creaked no more, he pulled himself up the ladder, joints stiff, face pale. He stood there in the cold night, blinking at the stars, hands trembling slightly as he secured the pit's lid once again. He would rest only briefly before walking to the next house, the next privy, the next reminder that his work was never truly done. For in every home there was another pit, another mound, another dark chamber waiting to be emptied. Yet for all the disgust directed his way, the glances of revulsion in the street, the mothers pulling their children aside when he passed, he bore no anger, perhaps because he had no time for it, or perhaps because, in some quiet part of him, he understood something others did not. He knew that cleanliness did not come from prayers or incense or piety. It came from labor, unacknowledged, invisible labor carried out beneath the noses of the very people who claimed superiority. He did not begrudge them, but he did not envy them either. After the night's work, he walked to the river, far downstream from where others fetched their water. He washed slowly, ritualistically, scraping what he could from his skin. He changed into a second tunic, nearly as stained as the first, and wrapped his hands in rags to keep the chill away. Then, when the first bird called from the trees and the sky began to pale with the soft pink of morning, he walked the quiet road home. There was no welcome waiting, no wife, no children, only a small room with a bed of straw, a cold crust of bread, and a fire that had long since died. He would eat what little he had, drink a cup of bitter ale, and then lie down in silence, drifting into sleep not from peace, but from exhaustion so deep it became indistinguishable from surrender. And so, with the filth of the town now buried beneath the soil or carried far beyond its walls, the gone farmer closed his eyes. His job was done. Until next time, when the sun finally crested the thatched rooftops of the market square and painted long, golden stripes across cobblestones still slick with dew, another sort of labor was already well underway. The sounds were familiar and steady. A thump here, a scrape there, the wet squelch of something soft meeting something sharper, all mingling into the quiet rhythm of a medieval butcher's shop. Yet beneath the sturdy oak table, under the blood-slicked boards and clattering hooks, worked someone smaller, quieter, and often forgotten. Not the master butcher whose name was etched in the minds of housewives and guildsmen, but his apprentice, a boy or sometimes a young man, crouched low among the cast-offs of animals, learning a trade with his hands in places others dared not look. His world was the underside of labor. From dawn to dusk and sometimes beyond, he scrubbed, scraped, fetched, carried, and obeyed without question. His tunic was stiff with dried blood. His boots, if he had any, were often split at the sole. The stench of iron and fat followed him wherever he went, not just the smell of raw meat, but of something more primal, life leaving a body, again and again, without ceremony. The butcher's apprentice began his morning long before the customers arrived. His first task was to sweep the floor with a bristle brush worn down to little more than twine. Not once, but several times. Once to gather the blood clots from the day before, again to collect the curled bits of gristle and bone, and a third to make room for what was to come. He then hauled buckets of water from the town well, heavy, cold, and splashing against his shins as he stumbled to the narrow alleys to wash the blood away. But the blood never truly left. It lingered in the creases of the stone floor, soaked into the wooden legs of the chopping block, and stained the grain of the table where carcasses were laid out like offerings to an invisible god. By mid-morning, the master butcher would arrive, wiping his hands on an apron already marked by years of use. With a practiced gesture, he would signal to the apprentice, and the real work would begin. Carcasses were unhooked from the back wall where they had hung overnight. Mutton, pork, sometimes venison if the season had been kind. They swung slightly, as if reluctant to be disturbed, their legs stiff, their heads gone, their bellies stitched closed with twine or not at all. The boy would catch the dripping blood in a bowl, strain it through cloth, and set aside for pudding or sausage. Nothing was wasted. Everything had a use, and it was the apprentice's job to know every part, not in theory, but in the slick, messy reality of it. With each thud of the cleaver, a new task emerged. Bone fragments scattered across the floor. Slabs of meat needed stacking. Organs had to be sorted. Liver, heart, lungs. sent into bowls and carried to waiting baskets lined with straw. The worst was the scraping, skin still damp with sweat and gore, needing to be cleaned of fat before being sent to tanners. The apprentice would crouch by the wall, holding the hide between his knees, pulling a dull knife across the slick surface over and over, the blisters on his fingers stinging with each pass. And through it all, the cold, butcher shops by necessity, were open and breezy, a way to slow the spoiling of meat. Even in summer, a chill hung in the shaded corners. In winter, it was worse. The boy's breath hung like mist in the air. His hands numbed until he could barely grip the handle of the cleaver he was told to clean, or the bucket he was told to carry. He had no gloves. Gloves were for noblemen, not for boys with blood up to their elbows. He learned quickly not to speak unless spoken to, not to flinch at the sound of bones cracking or dogs whining at the shop door, not to show disgust when asked to clean out the intestines, squeezing them inch by inch to remove their contents, his fingers red and raw from the process. He did as he was told because he had no choice. The path to becoming a butcher himself, a guildsman with rights, with wages, with respect, was long in line with obedience. Still, there were moments when the apprentice forgot his station. Sometimes, when the butcher stepped out or the shop fell briefly quiet, he would sit on the chopping block and look around, not in pride, but in bewildered endurance. He would stare at the rows of knives hanging like silent judges along the wall, each blade stained and dull with use, each one named by the master, as if the tools themselves bore witness to the years of labor. He would count the floorboards, trace the grain of the wood with his toe, watch the flies gather the edges of the bloodstains no scrubbing could fully remove. And sometimes he would dream, not grand dreams of wealth or glory, but smaller, humbler ones, a pair of warm boots, a cup of milk untouched by blood, a morning where he could wake up without the stiff ache in his back or the coppery taste of meat in his mouth. Perhaps one day his own shop, a smaller one, quieter, where he might choose when to swing the cleaver and when to rest. But for now, his place was beneath the butcher's table, in the low space where scraps gathered and orders were barked. He listened, he learned, and he waited. By the time the sun dipped low in the sky, the apprentice's limbs were sore, his clothes saturated, his ears still ringing with the day's harsh chorus. The butcher would count the coin, nod with satisfaction, and leave. The apprentice remained to sweep, to wash, to prepare the space for another day of cutting, scraping, boiling, and hauling. He would leave last, stepping out into the dusky street with blood still clinging to his cuffs and the scent of marrow thick in his nose. And as the town's windows glowed with evening candles and the chimneys puffed in streams of smoke into the cold, he would trudge home alone. Not a boy, not yet a man, but something in between, forged not by fire or fortune, but by meat, bone, and silence. In the half-lit dawn of a damp marshland, where reeds quivered in silence and fog clung low to the muddy banks, a solitary figure moved slowly through the shallows, shin submerged in the brackish water, each step an uncertain negotiation with the soft, sucking ground below. The air was cool and moist, thick with a musky scent of wet soil and pondweed, while dragonflies floated listlessly in the stillness, their wings trembling with quiet energy. The man wading through this silent wilderness was not a fisherman, nor a farmer looking to irrigate his fields. He was a leech collector, one of the most quietly reviled and yet desperately necessary professions in the strange hierarchy of medieval medicine. His name, though few ever cared to learn it, was Tomas, and his days were long, wet, and filled with quiet discomfort. Tomas wore a coarse tunic, damp and stained from years of swamp work, and his legs bore the telltale marks of his craft. Tiny round bruises, dry blood flecks, and itchy red welts where leeches had fed eagerly. There was no glamour in his profession, no admiration. Townspeople avoided him in the streets, giving him wide berth not out of cruelty but out of the vague, unsettling notion that he lived too closely with things that drained blood, things that clung without mercy and vanished with a twitch of the skin. Even children, bold and curious by nature, rarely spoke to Tomas. He had the lonely air of one who had become more a part of the marsh than the village that bordered it. But Tomas knew his trade well. At the turn of each season, he would rise before the sun crested the hills and make his way to Fun, carry with him a small wooden bucket, a curved reed staff, and the resigned patience of one who had long since surrendered to the rhythm of an unkind routine. He would wade into the wet, murky pools where leeches thrived, allowing them to latch onto his bare legs or arms. He could not afford the luxury of waiting for them to cling to livestock. A cow was too valuable to risk, and his employer had no animals to spare. His own blood, then, was the price paid to collect the creatures that doctors and barber surgeons swore could rebalance the humors, that mystical blend of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile that supposedly governed all human health. As the leeches latched on, Tomas would grimace faintly, not from pain, though there was some, but more from the slow, creeping cold of the water and the knowledge that the longer he remained still, the more leeches he could gather. Each leech would be allowed to gorge, and once engorged, Tomas would gently coax them off with a flick of his reed stick and drop them into his bucket, where they squirmed in lazy spirals, slick and bloated. Sometimes he would collect dozens in the morning, and on lucky days, hundreds. But he never felt quite clean afterward, even after scrubbing himself at the river bank with rough soap made from ashes and animal fat, though the village healer paid him. The coin was meager and came irregularly, doled out only when stocks were low or the apothecary ran dry. And even then, the transaction was brisk, nearly ashamed, the way one might buy something necessary but distasteful, like funeral clothes or rat poison. The healer would nod silently, drop the leeches into a clay jar, and push a few copper coins across the table, without looking Tomas in the eye. There was no thanks, no handshake, no blessing, just a quiet shuffle of feet, and the closing of a door. The risks of the trade were numerous and, more often than not, invisible. Infections festered in the open wounds left behind. Fever came and went without warning. Blood loss, over time, left Tomas dizzy and pale, and in the depths of winter, when the leeches went dormant, he was left to survive on whatever coin he had saved, which was rarely enough. There were no patrons for leech collectors, no guild to protect them, no feast days in their honor. When sickness swept the land, Tomas's work was in higher demand, but his status never changed. He was needed, yes, but never wanted. Sometimes, after a long day in a marsh, Tomas would sit quietly beneath an alder tree and watch the sky turn from gray to gold. He rarely spoke, not even to himself. He would simply sit, legs throbbing, skin crawling with the phantom sensation of leeches still clinging to him, and let the silence of the swamp fold around him like a damp shroud. He thought often of leaving, of finding work elsewhere, perhaps as a field hand or a thatcher, but the years had settled too deeply into his bones, and the marsh, strange as it was, had come to feel like home. It was the only place he could walk freely without being stared at, the only place where the stillness matched his own. Tomas never married. He had no children, no apprentices. When he died, years later, he left behind nothing but a rusted bucket, a few pieces of dried reed, and a jar of unused leeches still writhing faintly in the shadows. No one marked his passing with a bell or a prayer, but the healer, a younger man by then, didn't notice when the supply of leeches began to run thin and had to venture into the marsh himself, discovering too late the hidden currents, the biting cold, and the strange, uneasy silence that lived among the reeds. The work began long before the sun had found the strength to lift itself above the treetops, in a quiet pocket of the village where the smell never quite left, no matter how many seasons passed. The fuller's shed sat at the far edge of the hamlet, purposefully built away from the market square and the church, not out of disrespect for the labor within, but in reluctant acknowledgement of the overwhelming stench that clung to the place like a second skin. It was a building of function, not beauty. Half-rotted wooden planks sealed haphazardly together, a sagging thatch roof above, and an earthen floor below, soaked through with years of filth and fermented residues. And inside that unassuming little shed, the fuller toiled. To the outside world, the fabrics worn by lords and priests, by guild masters and town officials, appeared clean, soft, and dignified. Yet before those garments ever reached the elegance of cloth halls or embroidery, they passed through the hands and feet of the fuller, whose daily reality bore no resemblance to the refinement his labor made possible. The job was a paradox, humble in status, yet essential to the dignity of those who could afford luxury. But the fuller himself had no such privileges. His clothes were plain wool, his meals simple barley bread and cold stew, and his days consumed by one of the most punishing and nauseating tasks in the medieval economy. The process began with raw woolen cloth, straight from the loom, coarse, greasy, and riddled with impurities. The fuller's role was to cleanse this rough textile, to shrink it, thicken it, and transform it into something usable. But the tools of his trade were neither elegant nor sterile. The primary agent of cleansing was none other than stale human urine, collected from neighbors and passers-by. Left to ferment in barrels behind the workshop, warmed slightly in the early morning chill, and poured into wide stone troughs where the cloth would soak for hours. This was no passive soaking. No. The fuller himself had to climb in bare-legged, sometimes stripped entirely naked, and tread upon the soaked fabric again and again, his feet pushing the ammonia-rich liquid deep into the weave. The texture underfoot was foul, a squelching mass of wet wool and thick urine, warm and sticky. The scent acrid enough to sting the eyes and coil the stomach. And there he would remain for hours, walking in circles, shifting weight, pressing cloth down, turning it with wooden rods when needed. The smell clung to his skin, his hair, his breath. The fumes rose in heavy clouds and settled in the lungs. Many fullers developed chronic coughs or lesions along the legs and feet where the soaked fibers rubbed their skin raw. Infection was common, but so too was tolerance. The body, after weeks and months, learned to stop protesting. No crowd ever gathered to watch a fuller at work. Children were told to stay away, their mothers reminding them that decent folk had no reason to linger near that place. Travelers passed by with a handkerchief over mouth, and even the tax collectors sent someone else to deliver notices. The fuller lived in social isolation, not quite a pariah, but certainly not embraced. His was a job everyone relied upon, but no one wished to speak of, and so he grew quiet, not bitter nor angry, but inward reflective. In the muffled solitude of his daily task, he learned the patterns of silence. He could hear the soft rustle of cloth beneath his heel, the shift of a mouse in the rafters, the distant toll of the abbey bell announcing the next hour. Though he did not often keep time in the usual way, his time was marked by weight, the heaviness of cloth, the strain in his calves, the deep ache that announced the end of the day. His meals were taken alone, often in the doorway of the shed where the breeze might carry away some of the stench. A bowl of pottage, a heel of bread, and sometimes, if luck allowed, a sliver of salted pork. No one joined him. He had stopped asking, long ago. At home, he kept to himself, washing as best he could with cold water and coarse lye soap, scrubbing his hands until they bled, trying to remove a smell that would not be removed. His wife, if he had one, would sleep at the far edge of the bed. His children, if they dare hug him, would wrinkle their noses and pull away. And yet he did it, every day, without fail. There was no room for ambition in the life of a fuller, no clear path to promotion, no future where he might one day supervise a mill or open a shop in town. The best he could hope for was continued health, a roof that didn't leak too badly, and customers who paid in full and on time. The worst, which always loomed just outside the realm of immediate thought, was disease. A small infection left untreated could render him lame and end his ability to tread. Then the cloth would sit untouched, orders would go unfulfilled, and soon another man would be hired. No ceremony, no gratitude, just replacement. And yet, despite everything, the squalor, the stench, the solitude, there was a strange kind of rhythm to it. In a world that often felt chaotic, the work was steady, predictable. The cloth came in dirty, and after 3 days of soaking, treading, rinsing, and drying, it emerged pure. The transformation was complete. Perhaps, in some quiet corner of the fuller's soul, this was enough. A sign that something good could still emerge from what was most foul. A small triumph, repeated again and again. The sun, having finally gathered its strength, stretched its fingers across the rooftops and spilled light upon the fuller's shed. Inside, his shadow moved in slow circles within the trough, the wet wool clinging to his legs, the steam rising around him like a veil. The day was still young, and the work was far from done, far from the clamor of castles and the routines of manors. Tucked between moss-lace hills and dew-draped glens, there lived a figure few spoke of aloud, a figure whose presence brought with it an ancient discomfort, one born not of cruelty, but of the slow erosion of human dignity. The Sin Eater, as they were known, was a person chosen or rather condemned to a role so sorrowful, so deeply feared, that their mere shadow could cause shudders to be drawn and prayers to be whispered under trembling breath. It was a role born of desperation and belief, nestled in the space between hope and dread, where the soul's final journey was not guaranteed by a priest alone, but could be aided, just perhaps, by a final, somber ritual performed in the soft hush of candlelight by someone who had nothing else left to lose. The practice was simple in form but heavy in meaning. When a person died, particularly one who had passed suddenly or without confession, the family, desperate to ensure the soul of the departed did not wander or suffer, would send for the sin eater. This person would arrive not to the front door, but often from the back, stepping lightly over worn paths, cloaked in rags or whatever warmth they could gather, for sin eaters were never wealthy, and their lives were ones of social exile. They would be led, silently, into the dim room where the body lay, not surrounded by crowds, but observed from a distance, as though death were contagious and sorrow something to be avoided. A piece of bread and a mug of ale would be laid across the chest of the deceased, resting just above the heart, and the sin eater would slowly, solemnly consume them, mouth dry, throat thick, eyes unmoving, as though to swallow not just the food, but the very wrongs of the departed. To those who believed, the act transferred the sins of the deceased onto the sin eater, a transaction of spiritual burden, done in hushed reverence. But to the sin eater themselves, the act was one of survival, for they were often paid in pennies, crusts, or a bowl of porridge, barely enough to live by. And yet, they continued, not because they sought such a role, but because they had no other path left open to them. Once a person had performed the rite, they were marked. They were no longer part of the village in full. Children would avert their eyes, women would cross themselves, and men would fall silent when the sin eater passed. They were both needed and loathed, a paradox held together by fear and ancient superstition. They could never return to a normal life. Even if they had once been a mason, a baker, or a farmer, that identity was erased. No one would share a meal with them. No one would offer them work. No one would speak their name above a whisper. And so, they lived on the outskirts, in cottages that leaned sideways with rot, in huts where the thatch had long since frayed, surviving on what little they were paid, or on what scraps they could forage. The burden of sin was believed to weigh not only on the soul, but also on the body. Sin eaters aged quickly. Their skin took on a waxen hue. Their limbs grew frail before their time, and many believed their eyes, if you were ever brave enough to look into them, carried the shadows of those they consumed. There was no formal training, no ceremonial induction. Sometimes the role passed from parent to child, a terrible inheritance given not out of pride but necessity. Sometimes it was forced upon a beggar, a leper, or someone already outcast, who, when offered bread and coin for a simple act, could not refuse. Some claimed sin eaters went mad in time, haunted by the countless spirits whose weight they bore. Others said they became numb, walking ghosts themselves, unable to feel or dream, merely drifting between cottages, waiting for the next knock on the door, or the next death. They became part of the cycle of life and death in the community, but always in the margins, like moss on stone, present vital and yet unwanted. At times, clergy condemned the practice, calling a heresy, a pagan remnant dressed in Christian cloth. Yet, when desperation clawed at grieving families, when a loved one had passed without absolution, the priest's words fell silent in the face of ancient fears. Better be safe than sorry, they would murmur. Better the soul be eased, even if the method seemed dark. And so, sin eaters persisted, shuffling through centuries, through generations, always nameless, always burdened, always feared. No monument marks their lives, no tombstone names their deeds. They were the silent vessels of grief, absorbing what others would not carry, cast forever into spiritual exile. Their work was not one of cruelty or violence, but it carried a weight no knight or king could bear. The weight of invisible sorrow lay over time like the dust on forgotten scripture. They lived with the sins of others, and they died with no one to ease their own. And in that quiet, in that unbearable loneliness, they became something almost sacred, not saints, but sacrificial remnants of a belief system that feared death more than it understood life. And when their time came, no sin eater would arrive for them. There would be no bread, no ale, no whispered rites. Only silence and perhaps the faint stirring of leaves beyond a crooked door as the wind carried their story away. Unrecorded and unremembered, and far from their lonely graves, another figure moved through the stillness of the medieval night. A woman whose arms bore the stains of endless labor, whose back ached with the toil of generations, and whose place in the world was written not by fate, but by the expectations of a time that saw her not as a person, but as a vessel of service. It was somewhere near the edge of every medieval town or village, always just far enough from noble sightlines and the tidy world of merchants and guildsmen that the true remnants of humanity were gathered, not in churches or coffins, not in tombs of stone or in graves of carved words, but in dry piles of forgotten bone. And into this bleak and silent world came a man, humble in his dress, worn in his boots, and gray in his silence. The bone collector. His was not a profession one learned by apprenticeship or chose out of youthful curiosity. It was more often a last resort for the poor, the unwanted, or the ones left behind by plague, famine, or war. His job, grim and simple, was to retrieve the bones of the dead, from shallow graves disrupted by rains, from mass burial pits where the dirt no longer held fast, from execution sites where ravens had long since done their work, and from ruins of homes long abandoned. And so, with a sack on his back and a staff in hand, he wandered the outer rims of the living world, in the places where the veil between the present and forgotten had grown very thin. Mourning for the bone collector did not begin with the ringing of bells or the bustling of markets, but with silence. The birds did not often sing in these places, and if they did, it was a sharp call of carrion birds still lingering near their prize. He would set out before the dew dried, when the fog still hovered near the fields and the smell of damp earth clung to the air. Often, he worked alone, for who would walk beside a man who carried the dead in his sack? Even priests offered blessings from afar, and mothers told their children not to look him in the eye. He was a necessary evil in a world terrified of lingering souls. For bones remained unburied, the church taught, the soul could not rest. And if enough were disturbed, it was believed the very air might grow heavy with wandering spirits. The plague had taught many hard lessons, and among them was this: bones must be gathered, and someone must gather them. He knew the different sound they made. A femur striking stone gave a dull, hollow knock. A skull rolling from a loose embankment made a soft clatter, almost like pottery. The smaller ones, finger bones, ribs, vertebrae, often whispered into a sack like dry twigs, each one fragile, each one a remnant of breath long past. He did not speak as he worked. There was no one to hear him, and even if there were, what was there to say? He sometimes wore gloves of leather, but not always, for they wore through quickly. The bones were not always clean. Some still carried scraps of cloth or the hard, blackened remnants of rot. In summer, flies buzzed around the pits he opened. In winter, the ground was too hard to dig, and he would find bones poking out of frost like fingers reaching upward in protest. Sometimes he buried them himself, when a priest could not be summoned. A simple hole, a whispered prayer, nothing more. There were rules, of course. The church had strong opinions about what should be done with human remains. Bones from consecrated ground were to be reinterred respectfully. Those from plague pits were burned if possible or moved to charnel houses. Sometimes he delivered them to monks who stacked them in ossuaries, vast halls of death, where skulls stared out from walls like spectators in the theater of eternity. Other times, he brought them physicians who studied them, searching for signs of disease, of wounds, of mystery. And there were darker requests, too, whispered ones, alchemists who paid for skulls, midwives who needed infant bones for charms, and merchants who ground bones into powders for strange, foreign remedies. He did not ask questions. The less he knew, the more peacefully he could sleep or try to. He was paid poorly, if at all. A few copper coins per sack, or a heel of bread and a skin of weak ale. He sometimes found trinkets among the bones, rings on brittle fingers, or belt buckles buried in the mud. He could keep these unless a noble seal was on them. Then he turned them in, lest he be hanged for theft. Still, it was barely enough to survive. He lived alone in a shack by the marshes, where even the rats had little to steal. But in his solitude, he was safe, from disease, from ridicule, from the laughter of children and the disgust of goodwives. No one visited. No one asked after him, and that, in its own quiet way, was a kind of peace. What tormented him more than the work was the memory of the faces. Sometimes he could still see them, not as they were in life, for he had not known them, but as they must have been, a woman's cheekbones suggesting once soft smiles, a child's tiny jaw, the cruel fracture of skull shattered by something heavy. He wondered who they had been. Did they have names once spoken with love? Were they mourned? Or had they been forgotten before the worms finished their task? He did not speak of these things, not even to the bones. And yet, for all the horror of the work, there was a strange dignity in it. The bone collector, though outcast and unclean, was the last witness to a life that had ended in silence. He did what few others dared. He returned the remnants of the human form to the earth, or to the halls where memory lingered. He did not seek thanks, and none was given. But deep down, perhaps, he knew that without his burden, the world would be far more cursed. By dusk, he would return, weary, stained, often coughing from the dust that clung to the sacks. He would wash his hands in cold water, and sometimes, when the night was too quiet, he would light a candle for the ones he had carried that day. It was a small flame, flickering against the dark, a brief moment of light for those long past. And then he would sleep, if sleep came at all, dreaming not of bones, but silence, vast, endless silence. And so ended another day in the life of the bone collector, whose footsteps faded into the cold and dust of history, even as the bones he bore continued to whisper the stories no one dared speak aloud. By the time the last bones were tucked away in the darkness, reclaimed the corners of the ossuary chamber, another kind of labor emerged beneath the same moonlit skies, a figure often feared more than death itself. For his burden was not bones or blood, but something altogether more wretched. While the bone collector might have walked among the dead, it was a gong farmer who worked beneath the living, toiling in the rot and ruin of their daily leavings, crouched in the pitch-black bowels of the city where human waste gathered and festered. To call it work would be generous. To call it suffering would still be too kind. For this unfortunate soul, whose hands toiled in the putrid slurry of medieval cesspits, life was not only foul-smelling, it was shameful, isolating, and often brutally short. The job of a gong farmer began when most others ended, for their labor took place after the sun had long dipped beneath the horizon. Under cloak of night, when even the rats hesitated to scurry through the alleys, he would descend, carrying with him only the most basic tools of the trade, a wooden bucket, a long-handled scoop, and a strong rope, though no rope, however thick, could ever pull him from the mire of society's disdain. The pits he entered were known by many names: privies, cesspools, jakes, or simply night soil pits. Often dug deep beneath the outhouses of townsfolk, monasteries, inns, or even castles, these foul cavities collected the bodily waste of entire households over weeks, months, or years. And when they threatened to overflow, or when their stench became unbearable, it was a gong farmer who would be summoned with coin in one hand and pity in none. The scent, one imagines, must have been beyond comprehension. But those born into the station of a gong farmer could not afford to complain, nor could they hope for escape. Many were consigned to this work by necessity. Orphans with no trade, men shunned for disease or dishonor, or simply the poor who found that no other hands would reach out to help. Some towns even designated criminals to the role, exchanging years of prison for nights of excremental labor. They were paid, yes, sometimes even generously compared to common laborers. But no amount of coin could wash away the social stain. Children would run at the sight of them. Market women would clutch their wares as they passed. The very air seemed to recoil at their presence, as though the stench clung not only to their clothes but to their very souls. Working conditions were more dangerous than anyone above ground could truly fathom. Cesspits were often deep and poorly ventilated, and the accumulation of gases like methane and hydrogen sulfide made every descent a gamble. One wrong breath could lead to unconsciousness. One slip could see a man drown in filth. There were stories whispered by mothers to frighten naughty children, of gong farmers who vanished into the muck and were never seen again, their bodies only discovered years later, preserved in layers of decay like grotesque relics of urban neglect. Whether such tales were true hardly mattered. What mattered was the fear and the loneliness, and the ever-present risk that each night might be his last. And yet, the gong farmer served an essential function in the fragile ecosystem of medieval life. Without him, the streets would flood with sewage, wells would sour, disease, already rampant, would run unchecked. In a time before plumbing, before sanitation, before any true understanding of hygiene, the gong farmer was the first, last, and only defense against the collapse of health and order. He was a scavenger of sickness, a remover of rot, an unspoken guardian of public well-being. But for all that, he was never thanked, never respected. He walked home under the same moon that shone on lords and laborers alike. But he walked alone, sometimes washing in rivers that did little to cleanse him of the memory of the pit. During the day, when the sunlight returned and markets reopened, the townsfolk would resume their lives as if the night's filth had vanished on its own. But the gong farmer scent lingered in the alleys and in the minds of those who had passed too close. He was sometimes forbidden from entering churches. Some landlords refused him lodging. Even when he could afford a loaf of bread or a jar of ale, he might be turned away, not out of cruelty, but out of fear that the very essence of his trade might taint the establishment. For what if the smell clung to the pews, or to bread, or to the floorboards where others walked? And so he ate alone, slept alone, lived alone. Yet there were rare moments, quiet, private moments, when the gong farmer looked out across the city, knowing that his nightly suffering had kept hundreds from falling ill. There was no applause, no monument, but there was, perhaps, a kind of rough pride buried deep beneath the shame. His tools, soaked in filth, were as vital to the city's survival as the swords of its guards or the sermons of its priests. And when his bones finally gave out and he too was lowered into the earth, there were few mourners, but maybe, just maybe, the soil was a little cleaner, the wells a little safer, because he had endured. And it was in this quiet sacrifice, this unseen labor under moonlight and muck, that the story of the gong farmer becomes more than grotesque. It becomes a strange, sad ode to survival. He bore the weight of the city's waste so others wouldn't have to, and though the streets forgot his name, the stones beneath them still remember. And so, with the echo of dripping waste fading into the distance and the shadows of narrow alleys pressing closer around the remnants of that grim task, we shift our gaze now to yet another burdened soul, one whose suffering was not in the earth of the darkness, but in the shrill clamor of forge and flame, where skin blistered and lungs darkened in the relentless heat of a medieval furnace. Let us now descend into the world of the tanners, whose tortured craft came at a heavy, heavy price. The torchlight flickered dimly against the stone walls as the hours slipped silently past, and in the unseen corners of a medieval town, where no respectable villager dared to linger after nightfall, there existed one of the most foul and thankless professions in all of history. In these shadows, far from the candlelit warmth of hearth and hall, worked the gong farmers, those quiet custodians of filth, the uncelebrated laborers who were summoned not for celebration nor ceremony, but to descend into the human refuse of society, quite literally. The very name, gong, derived from the Old English word for going, was an unspeakable euphemism, a delicate veil over the truth of their work. They did not tend to crops, or to beasts, or to crafts of gold and silver. They tended to excrement, and they did so night after night, alone with their shovel, their cart, and the rank silence of the cesspit. The gong farmer's day began when others had long since ended. For reasons of odor and public decency, they worked only after dark, under the veil of moonlight, when the air was cool and fewer noses wandered near. Cloaked in coarse fabrics soaked in the stink of human waste, they crept through the alleys with carts and buckets, seeking the foulest places of the city, privies, latrines, and underground cesspits that had not been cleaned in months or even years. These were no simple outhouses, but deep, narrow chambers carved beneath taverns and homes, where years of waste were fermented in the dark, a slow, oozing mire of rot. Their job was not merely to empty a chamber pot, but to enter, descend, and extract it all, bucket by foul-smelling bucket, lifting the bubbling contents by hand, the scent clinging to skin and cloth with unholy permanence. The physical strain was matched only by the psychological torment. Inside the pits, the walls wept with damp and slime. Air was thick and cloying, heavy with methane and decay, and at times it suffocated like a warm, invisible shroud. Even breathing could be treacherous. More than one gong farmer collapsed in the fumes and drowned in the very filth they came to remove. Their only tools were shovels with rotting handles, wooden buckets that leaked from every seam, and thick woolen garments soaked in vinegar in the hope it might dull the overwhelming stench. It never did. The odor was a constant companion. staining skin, hair, and soul, a scent that no amount of washing could erase. And yet they endured. Society needed them, desperately, in an era before modern sanitation. Cesspits overflowed like infected wounds. Without the gong farmer, streets would have reeked of disease and death, for waste left to fester brought more than bad smells. It brought pestilence. Rats bred in the rot. Flies carried disease from pit to plate. The Black Death itself, that silent plague which once silenced a third of all Europe, found its home in such corners of squalor. So the gong farm became a necessary evil, a man simultaneously paid and avoided, feared and pitted. Town councils compensated them handsomely by medieval standards, but the coin came with a curse, the social curse of uncleanliness, of being forever outside the bounds of polite company. They were forbidden from dining in taverns, barred from churches, and rarely welcomed into homes. Their very presence turned stomachs. Even children crossed the road when they passed. And so they lived on the fringes. At night, they entered the city. By dawn, they were gone again, retreating to the outskirts where they dumped the waste far from village walls, often onto dung heaps, swamps, or farm fields. That last destination, though foul, was seen as a grim form of recycling. Human waste used to fertilize crops. Some might have called it clever. The gong farmer simply called it another task in his long, wretched night. Despite the misery, many held the job for years, even decades. It was dangerous and disgusting, yes, but it was also steady. In a world where plague struck at random and most lived at the mercy of the seasons, the gong farmer had an unshakable purpose. Waste never ceased. Filth never paused for famine or war. Even in death, it waited. And so did the farmer, shovel in hand, cart creaking slowly through the shadows of medieval stone. Still it bore its toll. Gong farmers aged before their time, worn by the ammonia that burned their lungs, the sores that festered on skin, and the loneliness that came from being needed but never respected. Their wives, if they had any, were often shunned too. Their children bore the stigma. Entire families lived on the edges of towns, huddled in huts built near bogs and marshes, forever marked as unclean. And yet, without them, no city could function. The nobility who feasted in gold-leaf halls owed their clean corridors to men who worked unseen. The bakers and blacksmiths, the clergy and kings, they all owed their health, in part, to the men who bore the burden of waste. The irony was bitter, but it was real, and perhaps that was the final cruelty of the gong farmer's burden. Not the smell or the filth or the scorn, but the knowledge that the very civilization that spat in their direction depended upon them utterly, and yet would never grant them thanks. As the dawn crept over the horizon, and the carts rolled silently back toward the edge of the village, their work would be forgotten for another day. The townsfolk would wake to clean streets, unaware of the man who climbed into darkness for them. And in his hut, the gong farmer would sit, boots off, hands raw, breathing shallowly as he waited for night to fall once more. In the slumbering hush of medieval world, where mist rolled low across jagged landscapes and time passed with the rhythm of bells and birdsong, there were men who ventured daily into the bowels of the hills, their lives etched in the rock and dust. These were quarrymen, stooped, dust-choked, and calloused, whose backs bore the burden of stone long before the grandeur castles and cathedrals took shape above. In an era that prized fortresses, churches, and cobbled roads, there was always a demand for stone, endless, tireless, and cruel. And so, into the cold gashes of the earth they went, morning after morning. Without question and without pause, their hearts quietly surrendered to the rhythm of hammers, wedges, and the soft groan of shifting earth. They worked in granite pits and limestone quarries, sometimes high in the hills where winds gnawed at their cloaks, and sometimes in darkened gullies where the sun never touched the ground. These were not vast, industrial sites like one might imagine today. No, they were raw, open wounds in the landscape, lined with irregular ledges and choked with rubble. The quarrymen's tools were primitive, iron chisels, mallets, and crowbars, not much change from the tools of the Romans before them. They would wedge iron into cracks, hammering again and again, hoping to split a block from the face. And when it did not yield, they would pour water into drilled holes and wait for frost to do what their strength could not. Sometimes the rock split cleanly, often it did not, and the hours of labor vanished in a jagged fracture that left nothing usable behind. There was no glamour in quarrying. No stories were sung about these men in taverns or courts. They wore no armor, earned no titles, and commanded no respect beyond the narrow circle of those who understood how vital their toil truly was. Every cobblestone beneath a cartwheel, every arch soaring over an abbey nave, every cornerstone laid in the foundations of manor or market owed its existence to their ache and sweat. Yet they remained invisible in the grand scroll of history, lost beneath the architects, the kings, and the masons who dressed and laid their stone. The danger they faced was ever-present and without pity. Rock split unpredictably, and a misjudged crack could send a slab shearing off in a deadly slide. Dust from the stone clogged their lungs, coating their throats and turning their breath shallow and wheezing. Many suffered from what we now know as silicosis, a slow suffocation that turned breath into agony and coughs into blood. Their bodies twisted over time, spines bent not just from the lifting, but from the posture of constant crouching and hammering. By 40, many looked twice their age, their skin hardened like the very stone they harvested. Then there were the accidents. Slips on gravel-strewn ledges, falling blocks, shattered limbs. There was no compensation, no surgeon to set a broken leg properly, and no path back to work once a man was lamed. A crushed foot might mean slow starvation for a family. A splintered rib, pierced lung, or spinal break was a death sentence. The injured either healed through sheer luck and grit or faded into the margins of the village, replaced by a younger, stronger man, eager or desperate enough to take their place. Meals were sparse, cold bread, onion, and maybe a sliver of cheese if the household was fortunate that week. Water was drunk from shared clay jugs, while cloaks were thrown over rocks as makeshift seats. When rain fell, it turned the quarry floor to slick, treacherous mud. When snow arrived, it froze their fingers stiff, but still they worked, because the master mason in town had ordered a dozen blocks by week's end, and a lord's purse would not wait for better weather. The irony was that, though they hewed the stone for which the great houses were built, they themselves lived in hovels of wattle and daub, their own homes roofed in thatch or bark. No carved lintels adorned their doorways, no flagstones paved their floors. Their children grew among the offcuts and stone dust, sometimes helping from the age of 8 or 9, carrying tools, fetching water, or sweeping rubble aside. Generations of quarrymen followed one another, their family lines as entwined the land as the veins of stone they carved. Despite the hardship, there was a strange rhythm to the life. Some found quiet pride in their precision, their ability to read the rock, to sense the way it would split or shift. There was a fellowship among them, forged in shared labor and silence, in the simple satisfaction of seeing a block fall cleanly, smooth, and square. In the evenings, they would limp home, shoulders aching, hands blistered, but with a heavy block marked for delivery. And that meant food on the table, a little firewood for the hearth, perhaps even a boiled egg to split with the children on Sunday. Sometimes, when the mist was low and the hills echoed only with a faint ring of iron on stone, it was easy to imagine they were shaping something larger than themselves, a cathedral they would never see, a tomb for a nobleman whose name they'd never know, or a bridge that might outlast the wars and winters to come. These thoughts gave shape to their toil, like distant bells tolling through fog. And yet, for all that romantic imagining, the truth remained. Theirs was a life of backbreaking repetition, of danger and silence, of slow, eroding pain that no prayer could soothe. The quarrymen carved the bones of the medieval world, and in return it carved them too, into shadows, into silence, into the gravel beneath history's feet. As the echo of their hammers faded each evening, and the wind swept clean the ledges they'd chipped at all day, the only sound that remained was a quiet sigh of stone returning to stillness. And so, as the quarrymen rested, bruised, and bowed beneath the weight of an unrelenting life, another group of workers stirred in the distance, summoned by smoke, sickness, and fear, those whose duty began where breath and life ended. The torches flickered low along the outer walls of the stone keep, their dying flames casting pale orange shadows across the cobbled passageways below, where most had already withdrawn into the warmth of their homes and chambers. The night had fallen deep and dark across the medieval village, muffling the wind and quieting the roads. But for one solitary figure, the coming of night was not a time for rest. It marked the beginning of another long and dreadful shift. Wrapped in layers of soiled wool, with heavy leather boots caked in a crust of old waste, The gaunt farmer emerged with a dim lantern in hand, his eyes squinting to the murky halo of its weak light. His task was not one of bravery, nor of glory, nor even of simple peace. It was a duty born of necessity and shame, one that kept cities from drowning in their own filth, but earned little more than disgusted glances and silent prayers from those he served. For tonight, like every night, he would climb into the bowels of medieval society, scraping away the stink of its secrets. The term gong referred not to sound or a bell, but rather to far less poetic substance, human excrement. Medieval cities, lacking the plumbing and sewage systems of future centuries, often relied on cesspits, privies, and open latrines to collect their waste. Over time, these pits would fill, and if left untended, would overflow into the streets, polluting the air and the water, spreading disease and pestilence through even the wealthiest districts. Enter the gong farmer, an essential, if reviled, figure whose job it was to descend into the pits themselves, often after nightfall, and with buckets, shovels, and iron rakes, scoop out the human waste, cart it away, and dispose of it far beyond the city walls. No one applauded. No one thanked them. They moved in the dark, stank to high heaven, and were often required by law to live outside the city proper. His lantern would barely pierce the gloom as he descended into a cesspit behind a tenement block, its wooden slats groaning under the weight of centuries of use. The smell was not something one could describe in simple terms. It was not merely foul. It was oppressive, thick, cloying, and layered with the scent of rot, decay, and disease. It hung in the air like a choking curtain, seeping into the nostrils, into the clothes, into the very soul. Some tried to mask it with herbs tucked into scarves or soaked in vinegar, but the truth was that no amount of lavender or sage could conquer the overwhelming stench of centuries-old human waste compacted and festering in the ground. Bent low his rake, the gong farmer worked in silence, scraping the dark sludge into barrels which he would later wheel away in a creaking handcart. Each movement was slow and deliberate, for the floor beneath him was often slippery, and a misstep could mean falling chest-deep into the very filth he sought to remove. There were stories, always whispered, of farmers who drowned in such pits, their cries muffled by the refuse and never heard again. Whether these were truth or exaggeration mattered little. In the minds of most, the job itself was already a form of death, a slow erosion of dignity, of health, and of companionship. The social cost was just as great. Gong farmers were widely shunned, not only because of their smell, which lingered long after their work ended, but because of the superstitions that clung to their profession. It was believed that proximity to waste brought disease, not just through touch, but through association. Some believed the waste poisoned the soul, inviting evil spirits or divine punishment upon those who handled it. And so, these men, though vital to the survival of the cities, were often excluded from taverns, markets, and churches. They were ghosts in their own communities, working under the cloak of darkness, so as not to offend the delicate noses and sensibilities of the day-walking classes. Yet in this dismal life, there was a certain rhythm. The gong farmer, like the grave digger or executioner, performed a necessary evil, and necessity brings with a kind of grim respect. While no one would invite him to dinner, they would certainly notice if he failed to appear for work. And though most did not look him in the eye, he might still receive the occasional loaf left on his doorstep or a nod of acknowledgement from another outcast, perhaps a leper or a rag picker or a butcher stained red from his trade. In the margins of society, a strange sort of fellowship grew between those who bore the weight of its filth in secrets. With the barrels full and the pit empty, the farmer would seal the cesspit with planks and stones, and begin the slow trudge through the narrow back alleys toward the city gate. Outside the walls, there were designated dumping grounds where the waste could be discarded or sometimes even used, mixed with straw and compost to fertilize the fields, a grim cycle of decay feeding life once more. The wheel of his cart groaned with every turn, echoing through the silent lanes like a reminder that civilization always left a mess for someone else to clean. As he paused to rest against the crumbling wall, wiping his brow with a rag already soaked through with sweat and grime, the gong farmer might have looked to the stars, barely visible through the smoke and mist, and wondered what other life might have awaited him had he been born with different luck. But such dreams were dangerous luxuries for those in his position. He would pick up the cart again, shoulder his burden, and vanish once more into the dark, unseen and uncelebrated, the silent keeper of society's most unpleasant truths. And as the last echo of his footsteps faded down the road, another figure, equally solitary and burdened, emerged from the butcher's alley, the flayer's apprentice, standing hesitantly before a rack of fresh carcasses, his hands trembling in anticipation of the task ahead. It was often beneath the surface, far below the cobbled streets and creaking timber-framed houses of medieval cities, where one of the most unappreciated and unpleasant professions quietly toiled in the depths of shadow and stench. These men, known as gong farmers, carried a burden that was not of gold or grain, but the putrid waste of entire populations. Their name, drawn from the old word gong, meaning dung, was a fitting if meager title for a role so utterly despised and yet so vitally necessary. And it is in the dim, candlelit silence of the city's underbelly that we now drift, to trace the slow, steady steps of a man tasked with a labor that no one wished to speak of, but which no one could live without. Imagine, if you will, a dark, cramped alley behind a row of clustered homes in medieval English town, perhaps in London or York or Norwich. There, beneath trapdoors and privies and latrine chutes, were cesspits, sometimes years or even decades in the filling. These were not neat chambers, but shallow cavities carved into the earth, where the daily discards of human life were left to stew, black sludge from privies, chamber pots emptied from second-floor windows, and all manner decay, mingling into a foul miasma that hovered like an invisible beast. Every so often, these cesspits had to be emptied, not by pipe or machine, but by hand, by the gong farmer. He would arrive at dusk, for this was work meant to be hidden. By law, gong farmers could only operate after dark, when most townspeople had retreated indoors, safely away from the sight and stench of what had to be done. Dressed in coarse wool and thick leather boots, garments soaked in a permanent scent that no washing could remove, he carried with him a long-handled shovel, a heavy hemp sack, and a patience born not of duty but necessity. These were often men with no other prospects, outcasts, or those crushed beneath debt. For all the horror of the task, it paid better than many other jobs, a strange reward for enduring the unendurable. Lowering himself into the pit, the gong farmer would stand knee or waist deep in the mire, scraping and scooping the dense, reeking mass into his sack, which once full, he would haul up by rope to his companion above. And there the work would repeat, hour after hour, with aching arms and stinging eyes, the heavy scent of ammonia thick in his lungs, and the constant dread that the pit wall might collapse or sudden sickness might seize him. For these places were not only disgusting but dangerous, filled with noxious fumes and swarming with rats and insects that could crawl beneath clothes or bite at raw skin. There was no celebration for a job well done, no handshakes, no warm mugs of ale awaiting him in the tavern. Gong farmers were shunned. Children threw stones, adults crossed streets. The stench clung to them always, and many were forced to live outside town boundaries, in shacks near the dumps where they would carry the waste to be buried. Their bodies were the toil visibly, their backs hunched, hands thick with calluses, skin raw from scrubbing, and faces prematurely lined with fatigue. And yet, without them, medieval cities would have drowned in their own filth. The streets above could not function without the silent labor below. Strangely, some among them found a grim rhythm to the work. The quiet of night, the lack of judgment from other tradesmen, the relative autonomy of the job, all offered a peculiar sense of control. There were those who came to accept the role as their place in the social order, knowing they served an invisible but essential function. For in the deeply religious worldview of the time, even the lowest task had its part in God's design. They were purifiers, in a way, cleansing the town of that which corrupted and decayed. And though no priest ever spoke of them from the pulpit, and no chronicler inked their names into parchment, they bore their role with a sort of resigned endurance. Still, the risks were real and many. Disease was constant, though rarely named. Fevers that burned through a man's strength in days, unexplained convulsions, or choking fits from the gas that sometimes pooled in low places. And then there was the loneliness. No family wanted a gong farmer as a suitor. No friends invited them to feasts. Some drank, some turned bitter, and some simply faded into quiet invisibility. It was a life not lived in stages, but endured in repetitions. Another pit, another night, another sack of rot beneath a silver moon. And yet, In the strange turning of history's wheel, there are moments when we glimpse them again, not in triumph, not in fame, but in the whispered records of city ledgers and court rolls. A complaint here about a pit left too long, a fine there for spilling waste on a cart path, or a rare petition from a gonged farmer who had fallen ill and begged for relief. Their legacy was not one of invention or glory, but of humble persistence in the face of universal disgust. They did what others would not, and for that alone, they belong in the tapestry of human labor. So as we leave this narrow alley and climb again to the streets above, we carry with us the faint, lingering awareness that beneath every clean surface, every flush memory, there once stood a man in the dark, shoveling what no one else would touch. And though he was nameless, thankless, and forgotten, he held up in his filthy hands the quiet dignity of survival. And now, with that shadow fading into the alleys of memory, let us walk toward the morning, where another soul stands ready to serve, equally burdened, equally unknown. For waiting behind thick stone doors and low-burning torches, the next job in our journey is about to unfold. In the winding alleys that crisscross the lower quarters of medieval towns, where the cobblestones were uneven and the shadows hung heavy with the weight of industry, there existed a trade so odious, so permanently stained by its own foulness, that even hardened townsfolk would keep a polite distance, offering no more than a nod to those unfortunate enough to carry its scent. These were the tanners, craftsmen of skin and stench, whose task was to take the raw, bloodied hides of slaughtered animals and transform them, through alchemy of rot and toil, into leather, an indispensable material for belts, shoes, armor, saddles, and more. Yet this transformation was no quiet miracle. It was a process so hideous in its details, so steeped in filth and decomposition, that many consider it a punishment rather than a profession. To become a tanner was not the result of romantic apprenticeship or noble family legacy. It was a path often inherited not by pride, but by proximity. The sons of tanners growing up amid heaps of rotting flesh and ankle-deep gutters of brackish runoff, their nostrils forever burned by the acrid bouquet of waste and chemical reek. Leather was precious, yes, and tanners were needed, but they were never embraced. Their houses stood away from the town center, near the rivers, or in specially designated districts where the wind could carry their stench away from the market stalls and noble halls. Even the laws of some cities prohibited tanners from living within the walls, forcing them to settle on the outskirts, near swamps or slaughterhouses where their odorous work would offend fewer noses. The tanning process began with filth, literally. First, the hides had to be cleaned of flesh, fat, and hair. This meant days of soaking in vats of water, lime, and sometimes even dog or pigeon feces, for it was the enzymes in the dung that loosened the hair and softened the hides. The workers would wade waist-deep into these reeking pits, sloshing the skins with poles, or worse, with their bare hands. Their clothes clung to them wet with rot, and their skin absorbed the stench so deeply that no washing, however vigorous, could scrub it out. The smell was part of them. It seeped into their homes, into their hair, into the very marrow of their bones, until they were marked as tanners from a distance of 20 paces or more. Once the hides had been defleshed and dehaired, they needed to be tanned, hence the name of the craft. Tanning involved soaking the skins in tannins, which were typically derived from oak bark ground into powder and mixed with water. This stage, though less foul in odor, was grueling in its length. The skins had to steep for weeks or months, requiring constant turning and monitoring, lest the leather become too stiff, too soft, or unevenly treated. This was not a job of artistry, but of vigilance and endurance. The tanner worked through frost and heat, rain and drought, for there was no season when the hides would stop rotting, no break from the fermentation of flesh. Perhaps what made the job most miserable, aside from the obvious filth and the cruel disdain of society, was the physical toll it exacted. The constant contact with caustic chemicals, lime, tannins, and ammonia-rich feces left the tanners with blistered hands, cracked skin, and open sores that healed slowly, if at all. The stench drew flies in clouds, and rats scuttled underfoot, drawn to the discarded offguts and spoiled hides. Respiratory infections were common, as were fevers from prolonged exposure to animal byproducts. Some tanners lost their sight early, their eyes damaged by chemical vapors and the relentless sting of hide dust. Others developed tremors from years of inhaling noxious fumes. And through it all, There was no prestige, no guilds that held him in esteem, no ceremonies of thanks for the leather that clothed the knights and merchants. Socially, the tanner occupied an awkward space. He was necessary but reviled. The townspeople needed his wares but avoided his presence. In church, they would scoot away from him. In taverns, few would sit beside him. Women hesitated to marry a tanner's son, knowing that his home would forever reek of hides and dung, that his wages, though stable, would never buy him entry into higher circles. And though some towns granted tanners limited rights, such as exemption from certain taxes due to the unpleasantness of their job, these concessions did little to lift the invisible burden of shame they bore every day. And yet, for all its horrors, the trade persisted. Leather was too valuable to discard, and so there would always be another boy apprenticed into pits, another set of hands submerged in waste, another figure moving through the misty early morning with a barrel full of skins and a face lined with quiet resignation. In the hierarchy of medieval labor, the tanner was the eternal outsider. Neither servant nor craftsman, not peasant but never accepted as artisan, doomed to a life of odor and isolation, whose daily grind was marked not by the ticking of clocks, but by the decay of flesh and the turning of hides in vats that never cease to fester. And when the day's work was done and the vats were still, the tanner would walk home beneath the pale twilight, alone but not idle, for even rest was steeped in stench, and even dreams could not rinse away the foulness that clung to him. His world was one of necessity, but never a beauty, and in the silence of his solitude, the tanner carried a burden as pungent as it was eternal. Now, in that same silence, we drift further into another tale, one set not in the stench of hides, but in the sharp, clinking shadows of the coin-filled counting houses, where another medieval misery quietly unfolded. As dusk fell over the thatched rooftops of the medieval village, and the sky turned from hues of honeyed gold to the softest charcoal gray, a different kind of labor emerged into the shadows. Those who did not till the soil or swing a hammer, but instead stood sentinel over the realm between the living and the dead. The graveyard night watchmen, often overlooked in the bustling daylight affairs of a town, stepped into their lonely duty when all others tucked into the warmth of hearth and kin. Their presence was not merely symbolic, nor was it rooted in any grand heroism. It was a job no one wanted, but someone always had to take, often the poor, the elderly, or those unable to perform more vigorous work. Their charge was simple on paper, but harrowing in practice: to guard the freshly buried from grave robbers, hungry beasts, wandering souls, and perhaps worst of all, the terrifying suspicion that the dead were not quite as still as they appeared. They stood wrapped in heavy cloaks against the chill that crept through mossy graveyard paths. The night was not silent, contrary to what some might imagine. It breathed with unsettling life. The groan of old trees swaying, the flutter of bats' wings above, the distant bark of dogs, unsettled by something unseen. Beneath the earth, the watchmen feared movement not from animals, but from the buried themselves, those laid too soon in the soil. Medieval medicine was woefully inadequate, and premature burials were not uncommon. It was said that some of the watchers placed thin cords in coffins, attached to little bells above ground, just in case a dead person awoke and rang their desperate plea from below. It was from this fear that the term "saved by the bell" would one day be born, though at the time no one found the phrase amusing. Their nights were not only long, but psychologically tormenting. Alone, wandering through rows of burial mounds under flickering torchlight, their eyes played tricks, their minds conjured shapes from shadows, and their ears imagined whispers carried by the wind. Every rustling of leaves might be something more. Every overturned clump of earth might mean the grave was disturbed. It was their duty to inspect, to brave the dread, to check for signs of foul play or foul resurrection. If grave robbers had struck, and they often did, hunting for jewelry, bones from medical schools, or remains to sell as relics, it was a watchman's responsibility to alert the town constable or, in smaller villages, deal with the desecrators themselves. Imagine, if you will, being unarmed, elderly, and half-blind in the dark, facing a desperate, possibly violent thief. This was no job for the faint of heart. Even more unsettling were the moments when no human intruder had disturbed the grave, yet something felt off. A coffin half sunk into a sinkhole, a grave that looked freshly disturbed, though it had not been touched in weeks. Stories began to circulate, tales of the dead rising in protest, of angry spirits lurking among the stones. The church taught that proper burial rituals kept the soul at peace, but in practice, any deviation could lead to fear of revenants. Restless corpses returned from death. Not quite ghosts, not quite men. The watchmen were not scholars. They had little power to question doctrine, but they had eyes and they had ears, and sometimes they saw things they could not explain. The conditions were harsh. Rain turned the graveyard paths into sucking mud. Snow turned the markers into white blanketed mounds, hiding signs of tampering. Wind howled through stone and bone alike. The watchmen could not simply stand still, lest they freeze. They walked slowly, endlessly, wrapped in scarves and layers, boots wrapped in rags to hold back frostbite. There were no torches provided, not by the poor churches that owned the land. Most watchers brought their own, if they could afford one. Others used oil lamps or nothing at all, trusting the waning moon to light their way. One misstep could mean a broken leg in a sunken grave, or worse, falling and being unable to rise, the cold creeping in as the world slept on. They were not respected. In the daylight, townsfolk avoided them. Some believed that their constant presence among the dead made them unclean, cursed, or odd. Children threw stones at them, mocking their smell or their vacant expressions. Even the clergy, who relied on their quiet labor to protect holy ground, often turned a blind eye to their needs. They were paid poorly, sometimes not at all, instead given shelter in nearby sheds or leftover bread from the monastery kitchens. Despite all this, they returned each night, cloaked and silent, whispering prayers not for their safety, but that they might make it until morning without needing to ring a church bell or scream into the void. There were moments, too, when the job pierced the soul in more personal ways. Imagine guarding the grave of your own child or spouse, lost too early to plague or childbirth. To stand above them, alone, hour after hour, imagining them just beneath the earth. The grief of the watchman was stitched into the soil with every step, every quiet breath, every tear that froze before it could fall. These men and women carried not only the weight of the dead, but the sorrow of memory and the pain of silence. By dawn, the cold would begin to ease, though barely. A pale light would stretch slowly across the horizon. The village roosters would begin their chorus, and the watchmen would lower their eyes, step softly away from the graves, and vanish into the alleys before the town fully awoke. Few would greet them, fewer still would thank them, and yet each night they returned. They returned not for glory nor gold, but because someone must. Because when darkness pressed hardest upon the earth, someone had to stand between the living and what lay beneath. And while the graveyards exhaled their morning mist and the world resumed its daily rhythms, another job awaited at the farthest edge of the medieval city, one so dirty and despised that even the rats recoiled when approached. As the bells loomed high in the church tower, tall and solemn in their ancient cradles of wood and iron, the figure of the bell ringer stirred beneath them, a lone silhouette caught in the tangled web of ritual and repetition. The bell tower was his whole world, an echoing chamber of dust and drafts, where time was measured not by clocks, but by chimes that marked the rhythm of medieval life. His was not a role chosen with pride or aspiration, but inherited like a burden or thrust upon him in a moment of need. It was not a position of power or piety, but one of backbreaking routine, often isolated, always vital, and seldom respected. The bell ringer, like the bells themselves, was expected to be invisible until called into motion. Each day began before the first light crept over the cathedral's stone arches. Still in the shadows of early dawn, he would clamber up the narrow spiral stairs, carved from cold stone and worn smooth by generations of footsteps. The climb was endless and steep, enclosed on all sides by the circular curve of walls that whispered with every movement. He carried with him a small lantern, the only source of light in the dusky interior, and it flickered like a frightened breath as he ascended, step after step. Upward he went, past cobweb niches, past tiny alcoves that once may have held holy relics, until the roof beams of the bell tower yawned open above him. The bells waited in the dark like slumbering beasts. Crafted from bronze and iron, they bore names and inscriptions in Latin, blessings etched in cold metal that could not ease their weight. When silent, they seemed ancient and dignified. But when roused, when pulled by thick ropes that coil down like vines, they roar with voices that could rattle the bones and quake the air for miles. The bell ringer's arms were his livelihood, callous and bruised from years of yanking, swinging, guiding the ropes with a rhythm that had to be perfect. One mistake in timing, one slip of grip, and the heavy cord could whip back with violent force, enough to break a hand or wrench a shoulder from its socket. And yet, even danger became routine. The greater challenge was the burden of endless, enforced regularity. Bells had a toll for Mass, for Matins, for Vespers. They rang for weddings, for baptisms, and always, always, for death. Each funeral bell was a long, slow mourning, where every chime was a solemn heartbeat echoing to the village below. The bell ringer alone felt their weight, not only in muscle but in spirit. He was a keeper of transitions, the harbinger of joy and grief, beginnings and ends. People heard his work, but rarely saw his face, and when they did, it was often in moments of solemnity or urgency, not celebration. He rarely spoke of his isolation, because few ever asked. Up in the tower, his world was sound and silence, light and shadow. He learned to recognize the days by the tone of the bell and the winds that stirred around the rooftop arches. On feast days, the tolling was furious and grand, long sessions that left him drenched in sweat, lungs heaving as if he had sprinted across fields. On holy days, the toll was precise and measured, with pauses that mirrored the sacred nature of time. During storms, lightning crackled dangerously close, and the bells would hum with static, as though nature itself was joining the song. During plague seasons, they tolled more often than not, and each heavy peal echoed the deep sorrow of a village slowly hollowed out by death. But his duties went beyond just ringing. He maintained the bells, greased the iron clappers, checked the wooden frames, patched the ropes when they frayed. These were tasks done in silence, often while balancing precariously among beams, or leaning into cold gaps where birds nested and the wind howled like a distant wail. In winter, the bells froze, and the tower became a chamber of frost. His breath turned white in the dim light. His fingers stiffened until he could barely grip the ropes. Yet, no matter the season or weather, the bells had a sound. Sleep was erratic. Meals were taken at odd hours. The bell ringer's life was ruled by the calendar of the church and the needs of the town. There were no holidays for him, no escape from the constant pull of rope and duty. On festival days, while others danced and drank in the square, he was at the tower's peak, sending out joyous peals that he could not enjoy himself. And when tragedy struck, when bells tolled for dozens at once, he was the one who pulled them, alone with the sound of mourning that he, more than anyone, could never forget. Though the tower offered a view of the world, he remained apart from it. The bell ringer watched seasons change through narrow windows, saw crops rise and fall, saw lovers meet beneath the church steps, saw children grow into parents and parents vanish into the grave. All of it passed before him like a story glimpsed through fog glass, real yet unreachable. His hands, so strong from pulling ropes, felt the weight of loneliness more than any bell. And yet, there was a strange peace in the rhythm, a quiet pride in being part of something bigger, even if it went unrecognized. The bells would not sing without him. Time would not move. He was a silent guardian of passing hours, the hidden metronome of the town's spiritual life. And while he bore the aches of labor and the ache of solitude, he also carried the strange honor of being remembered not by name, but by sound, the sound that marked life itself, one peal at a time. And as the bell's echo faded into the evening wind, the bell ringer leaned against the stone wall, breath slow, fingers trembling slightly, already knowing that soon, so very soon, another hour would demand his strength again. And down below, as the last reverberations settled over rooftops and courtyards, another soul stirred from their rest, unknowingly held by the rhythm set high in that ancient tower. As the stillness of dawn settled over the quiet marshlands, a thick mist hung low over the bogs like a lingering ghost, stretching in silvery sheets across the surface of the water. Beneath the soft hush of morning bird song and the gentle lapping of reeds, another figure moved, slowly, silently, carefully. The leech collector began their day not in warmth or comfort, but ankle-deep in the tepid, murky waters of the medieval wetlands. Clad in garments already stiff from yesterday's dampness and decay, The collector stepped forward into the shallows, wincing slightly as cold water slid up their legs, seeping into worn boots and soaking through layers of fabric. This was not a job for the faint-hearted, nor for those blessed with other choices. It was a profession reserved for those pushed to the edges of society, with few options, fewer protections, and even less dignity. To gather medicinal leeches, slippery, bloodthirsty creatures thought to hold healing powers. The collector had to tempt them with the warmth of their own body. No fancy tools or nets were used. Instead, the body itself became bait. The collector would stand still, sometimes for hours, in pools where leeches thrived, waiting for the small black worms to sense heat and movement and latch on. And latch they did with eagerness. The leeches would attach themselves to bare skin, sinking their tiny, sharp teeth into flesh, secreting an anesthetic that made the bite feel like a soft pinch, at first. But as the blood flowed, the pain grew, and with it, a sense of creeping discomfort that never quite left. Some collectors would bear dozens at a time, writhing, sucking, bloating leeches, all drawing life from their legs until the waters around them turned faintly red and the edges of consciousness began to blur. The work required not just stillness, but silence. Movement would scare the leeches. Talking or humming might disturb the rhythm of the water. The collector became a living statue, flesh as lure, body as tool, presence as sacrifice. On some days, they would return with baskets full of leeches, their limbs trembling, skin raw and swollen, and blood trickling down beneath their trousers. On worse days, when the weather was too cold or the leeches too few, they would come back nearly empty-handed, but bitten nonetheless. The pain was not just physical. It was layered with the knowledge that their worth was measured in the number of leeches harvested. Failure meant hunger. Too many empty days meant eviction, beatings, or worse. Leech collecting was especially common among women, widows, and children, those whose families had collapsed under debt or sickness, and who now had to scrape a living from whatever the land would offer. Children, especially, were seen as ideal bait. Their thinner skin and smaller bodies drew leeches more quickly, making them more efficient, though far more vulnerable. Some families would send their youngest into the swamps with tears and warnings, hoping they would return with enough to sell in the market stalls or to wandering physicians. But many did not come back whole. Leech bites, though small, opened the body to infection, and with each bite came the risk of fever, fatigue, and sepsis. When paired with the swamp's natural hazards, mosquitoes, waterborne diseases, hidden sinkholes, these dangers made each day's labor a quiet gamble between survival and surrender. The irony was bitter. In a world of suffering, where medicine was a blend of hope and guesswork, leeches were seen as tools of healing. Physicians prized them for bloodletting, believing they could balance the humors and drain away sickness. Noblemen paid handsomely for jars of them. Monasteries kept leeching chambers ready for ritual bleeding. In cities and towns, barbers proudly displayed leeches in their shops, floating in cloudy glass jars like tiny black magicians a cure. But none of them ever asked where those leeches came from, nor who stood in cold marshes to harvest them, nor what it cost to fill a jar with such invisible pain. The collector's suffering remained unseen, forgotten as soon as the leeches changed hands. The clothes of a leech collector never truly dried. Their skin, perpetually soft and waterlogged, cracked easily. Infections found the smallest wounds and spread slowly, often unnoticed until it was too late. Limping was common. Scars were constant. It was said you could always spot a leech collector by their gait, cautious, dragging one leg slightly, as though always half sunken in mud. And then there was the smell. Swamp rot and bodily fluids clung to them long after the day ended. Soap was a luxury few could afford. Bath was rare. Public shame? Abundant. Still, there was a strange rhythm to their work, a quiet discipline born of necessity. The leech collector learned the habits of the marsh, the places where the leeches swarmed thickest, the times of day when they were hungriest, the songs of the birds that warned of rising water. They read the land like a slow, breathing book. Every ripple meant something. Every gust of wind might signal change. In this sense, they were more than gatherers. They were observers, listeners, quiet witnesses to a world of decay and rebirth. The marsh was not cruel. It was merely indifferent, and in that indifference, the collector found a kind of peace. But peace, like everything in the medieval world, was fragile. One illness could end a career. One infected bite could spread to the bone. There were no pensions, no protections. If a leech collector could no longer stand, they could no longer earn. Many died quietly, buried without name or prayer. Forgotten even faster than the blood they gave to the worms they harvested. The leeches lived longer than their bait. And so, as the sky turned gray and the fog thickened once more, the collector stepped from the swamp, shivering, basket in hand, blood dripping quietly into the mud. The path home was long. The sun would rise soon. But for now, the work was done. And as another day bled into the next, while the leech collector vanished into marshes and midwives fought through pain and prayers, another figure moved silently through the still air of sanctuaries, cathedrals, and abbeys, a presence not known for voice or influence, but for listening and obeying without question. These were the scribes and monastic illuminators, men bent beneath flickering candlelight, spending their waking hours hunched over vellum and parchment, etching words they could not always understand into books they could never call their own. Though at first glance their world seemed tranquil, quiet chambers filled with incense and chants, woolen robes and orderly scripts. Theirs was a life steeped in intense discomfort, social rigidity, and bone-aching repetition that drained the spirit as surely as physical toil wore the flesh. The job of a medieval scribe or illuminator might appear noble or serene to the modern eye, a scholar's life surrounded by the smell of ink, the soft rustle of pages, and the security of monastic walls. But for those who lived it, the work was often painfully monotonous, physically taxing, and cloaked in a kind of intellectual servitude. These monks, often recruited in youth or even assigned by birth, rarely had a choice in the matter. Their days began before sunrise with cold prayers and unheated stone chapels, their breaths hanging in the dim air as bells called them to matins. Then came their work, a long procession of hours spent seated on hard wooden stools at slanted desks, eyes straining to copy page after page of sacred texts, missals, or legal documents. The tools of their trade were as demanding as their schedules. Quills had to be carved precisely and dipped repeatedly into handmade ink, which itself had to be mixed from soot gall nuts and iron salts, a process requiring time and delicate care. One mistake, a smudge letter, an accidental blot, could mean restarting an entire page painstakingly scripted over days. For illuminators, the work was even more taxing. Gold leaf had to be applied with breathless precision, and colored pigments were ground from minerals like lapis lazuli and cinnabar, often exposing the artist to toxic dust that slowly poisoned their lungs and skin. The same beautiful blues and brilliant reds that decorated holy texts came at a silent cost, etched into the veins of the workers who gave them life. Their work was solitary, and in many monasteries, it was performed under the rule of silence. Speaking was forbidden for much of the day, leaving the scribe to wrestle with his fatigue, errors, or frustrations alone. Meals were simple, repetitive, and silent too, often consisting of coarse bread, weak broth, and ale. In winter, the scriptoria grew unbearably cold, and ink would freeze if not kept near a flame. In summer, the air grew heavy with the scent of sweat, tallow, and drying hides. Still, they worked, hour after hour, letter by letter, laboring not for glory, but for obligation and obedience. Their eyes blurred, their backs curved, and their fingers cramped. The repetition was mind-numbing, the posture excruciating. Many scribes developed chronic pain or arthritis from years of awkward writing positions, but complaining was not permitted. This was a discipline of the soul, the mortification of the body through godly purpose. Their suffering, they were told, brought them closer to heaven. Their work preserved knowledge for generations. And while that may be true for the individual monk in the moment, for the boy who became a man in that same cold room, scratching the same black letters into endless pages, the reality was far less grand. Even when the work was done, there was little celebration. The finished manuscripts were the property of the abbey or cathedral. They were stored under lock and key, sometimes never read aloud or used again. The scribe's name often went unrecorded. Anonymity was considered virtuous. Pride was discouraged, and the value of the work lay not in creativity or innovation, but in perfect replication. There was no applause, no recognition, just the turning of another page, the carving of another quill, and the tightening of already tired hands around it. And yet, in this bleak quiet, some scribes found solace. The rhythm of copying could be meditative, the closeness to sacred text, a strange intimacy. Some, when allowed, added tiny flourishes, small animal doodles in margins, or cryptic jokes hidden between lines. These brief moments of rebellion were rare but precious, like tiny windows into a soul otherwise buried beneath obedience. Still, these flickers of life were fleeting, and the work always returned, as relentless as the ticking of time itself. So it was that the medieval scribe, forgotten by history's fanfare and unsung by the very books he created, lived a life of ink and silence. Bound to parchment and rule, he gave voice to the past, but never used his own, a servant to words he did not choose, copying stories while his own was written in shadows and fatigue. And in this dim world of flickering flames and scratched vellum, another figure waited to take up a mantle equally obscure and perhaps even more thankless, one who would never know ink, but would instead know the cold weight of judgment. The clanging of the town bell in the early morning often marked not just the beginning of a new day, but also the renewal of danger for those whose duties were bound to fire and smoke. Among the many shadowed and seldom thanked professions of the medieval world, the role of the full-time lamplighter and fire watcher was one of the most ceaseless, nerve-gnawing tasks one could inherit or be conscripted into. In the absence of electricity, with only flickering flames to chase away the darkness, these figures became an unseen force guarding every thatched rooftop and timber beam from turning to ash. Their world was defined not by calm, but by the constant threat that even a single careless ember might spark catastrophe. As the streets quieted each evening and the rest of the town retreated behind bolted shutters, the fire watchers began their lonely vigil, lantern in hand, ears trained to the sounds of silence that could erupt into chaos in a heartbeat. The fire watcher's shift began long after others had eaten their supper and curled beneath woolen blankets. He wrapped his body in a heavy wool cloak, blackened and smelling faintly of soot, and took up his iron-tipped staff, used less for defense and more for poking through piles of leaves, prodding smoldering hearths, and nudging half-extinguished torches into complete darkness. His route was both a duty and a ritual. Narrow alleys first, then looping through the stable yards, around the blacksmith shop with its ever-dangerous coals, past the bakeries with their morning ovens already set to preheat by sleeping apprentices. He passed through zones of silence that were laced with peril, his feet crunching on frozen mud or slick cobbles, each sound amplified by the quiet of slumbering townsfolk. His nose learned to detect not just smoke, but the slight metallic tang of heated iron, the resinous burn of pine wood, the whispering puff of smoldering straw. Each scent meant something. Each flicker in the dark could mean everything. But there was more to the job than simply catching fires as they started. Lamplighters were responsible for illuminating the night in safer districts. They carried flame carefully, a cup of fire enclosed within a glass lantern, walking a slow path from post to post, lighting candles set in iron sconces or small lanterns suspended by rusty chains. The world they walked through was one of elongated shadows and muffled echoes. In some towns, these lamplighters carried small horns that they might blow if a fire broke out, though many were reluctant to raise a false alarm, knowing that a town roused for no reason might retaliate with curses or thrown boots from windows high above. The irony of the job was ever present. Their purpose was to maintain fire while preventing it. A delicate balance was required. One could not drop a torch or allow a lantern to break, lest their very effort to prevent fire became the spark of disaster. Worse yet, they were often accused when fires did occur. Should a blaze take hold and consume a row of homes, an all too common occurrence in wooden towns hemmed in by wind, the fire watcher might be blamed. Were they asleep? Were they negligent? Had they missed the warning signs? The suspicion, hovering like a fog, made the job not just exhausting, but deeply isolating. They were paid little, often scorned, and sometimes whipped or imprisoned if a fire was deemed preventable. And so, the fire watchers trudged through every season. In winter, their beards froze and breath turned to white clouds before them. In summer, they sweated beneath wool, the torchlight attracting clouds of insects. There was no holiday, no night off, no respite save the brief moments between the end of one shift and the beginning of another. When illness struck, they walked anyway. If they died suddenly, someone else was forced to walk their route that same night, for the town would not risk a single unguarded hour. In the grand halls of nobility, The consequences of fire were no less feared, but more precautions could be afforded. Stone walls, guards, servants assigned to every corridor. But even castles burned. In smaller towns and villages, where the poor clustered together in structures made of mud, wattle, and thatch, where chimneys were a luxury and open flames burned at floor level, fire was not just an occasional hazard. It was an ever-present threat. And so the fire watcher, even if ignored and undervalued, was essential. His presence meant that some homes might still stand by morning. Sometimes the job was passed down through family. A father would walk his route with his son at his side, the boy learning which homes always had dangerous embers, which baker kept his ovens hottest, which alley collected the wind in such a way that even a cigarette tossed by a drunk could ignite a blaze. The knowledge was practical, built from experience, not books. Few fire watchers could read, and fewer still could write. But they knew every draft, every creaking beam, and every smell the night air carried. They grew old before their time. Knees ached from countless stairs. Shoulders hunched from the weight of water buckets carried again and again. Their hands bore the fine scars of burns and blisters. Their eyes adapted to darkness, so deeply that daylight became an irritation. Their sleep was fragmented, interrupted by calls and commotion, by dreams of flames that danced behind closed lids. Many died unnoticed, found curled in cloaks in some alley, a lantern guttered beside them. The town moved on, but their route remained, filled again by someone else too poor to say no. Yet in the silence of night, in the stillness between footsteps, the fire watcher was a presence of quiet resilience. He bore no weapon but his vigilance. He claimed no fame but the lack of disaster. His work was not to build, nor fight, nor even to heal. It was simply prevent, to watch, to endure. In a world where flame was both lifeblood and death sentence, where light meant safety but could so quickly turn to ruin, he was a narrow line between warmth and ash. And while few sang songs of the fire watchers, fewer still could deny that their lonely march through the midnight dark was one of the most important and exhausting duties in all the land. And still, the town slept, warm and unaware, while the fire watcher moved onward, only for the dawn to hand the burden to another, just as tired, just as forgotten. The next trade, though even more silent and equally ghost-like, lived not in the light of lamps but in the cold, bloodied aftermath of war. As dawn broke over the bustling market towns of medieval England, where the scent of fresh bread mingled with the braying of livestock and the echoes of tradesmen preparing their stalls, there remained, hidden from the sounds and sights of morning, a world so foul, so forgotten, that even the rats hesitated before entering it. Beneath the timber-framed houses and cobblestone alleys ran a maze of cesspits, privies, and foul-smelling channels, places where no sunlight ever reached and no fresh air dared to linger. It was in this revolting underworld that one of the most dreaded apprenticeships in medieval life took root, that of the gong farmer's assistant. If the gong farmer himself was seen as the unfortunate king of excrement, the boy who followed him, often no older than 12 or 13, was little more than a disposable tool, easily replaced, barely trained, and hardly acknowledged by the world above. These apprentices, drawn often from orphanages, debtors' wards, or the impoverished families who could not afford to feed another mouth, were handed down to this dreadful trade by circumstance, not choice. While noble-born boys learned to wield swords or recite Latin verses under candlelight, these children were thrust into the world of human waste. Their days and nights spent ankle-deep in sludge that oozed through crumbling wooden trapdoors and primitive stone channels, clogging and fermenting in the dark places between civilization's facade. Their first task, often given with little more than a grunt of instruction from their master, was to descend into a pit with a wooden pail and a long-handled shovel, their only light a tallow candle clenched between teeth or tucked into a narrow crevice of the wall. The stench, unbearable to most, became a cloak they wore like a second skin, seeping into their hair, their ragged tunics, and their very breath, so that even in the open air passers-by recoiled as they walked by, no matter how thoroughly they washed in the nearby stream. And they rarely had time for such luxuries. The stink followed them like a curse. And yet, this was merely the beginning. The apprentice's true challenge was not just tolerating the physical filth, but surviving the suffocating darkness below, where the air grew thick with methane and other invisible gases, where a single spark could ignite the very walls in a deadly burst of flame, and where collapse and drowning were as real a threat as disease. Many apprentices fell ill within weeks of beginning, stricken by fevers that burned to the body like fire. Skin sores developed from the constant exposure to corrosive ammonia and bacteria, and eyes grew red and weepy from the acrid fumes. The stronger boys endured for a season or two, learning to steady their steps across slippery stones, to sense the presence of foul air before it stole their breath, and to hold their shovels just so, to scoop without splashing, lest their own faces be baptized by the very filth they sought to remove. The weaker ones, and there were many, simply vanished from the ranks, sent back to the streets to die in alleyways or buried quietly in shallow graves, their names unrecorded, their faces forgotten. And yet, as revolting as it was, the work was critical to functioning of the city. Without these nameless, filthy boys and their gong farming mentors, the great towns would have drowned in their own waste. Their labor kept the streets from overflowing with filth, the privies from collapsing into their foundations, and the water sources from being contaminated beyond use. They worked not for praise, for none would ever thank a gong farmer, but for survival. A few pennies here, a crust of bread there, and the rare acknowledgement of an alderman or watchman who nodded grimly as they passed, knowing well the price of their own clean streets. The apprentices learned strange wisdom in their darkness. They could identify, by smell alone, the illnesses sweeping through the town. They saw, in the contents of the privies, the diets of the rich and the desperation of the poor. They observed the habits of priests, lords, and thieves alike, for everyone, high and low, used the same hidden chambers of waste. And in those silent moments, knee-deep in foulness, they sometimes whispered to themselves stories of what they would become one day. Perhaps a merchant, perhaps a sailor, perhaps anything but this, though many knew, deep in their hearts, that few roads led out of such work. Once a boy had carried the stink of the pits. It clung to him forever, marking him as unclean in the eyes of all save those who lived as he did, in the shadows beneath society. Some masters treated their apprentices with a rough kindness, sharing what little they had, and teaching them how to avoid the worst dangers, how to earn an extra coin from back-alley privy cleanings, and how to keep one's head down in the face of scorn. Others were cruel, using the boys as beasts of burden, mocking them for weakness, and offering no protection when the fumes grew too strong or the pits too deep. There were whispered tales, too, of boys lost forever in the labyrinthine cesspits beneath the great city gates, swallowed not by beasts, but by carelessness, by overwork, or by despair. And in those stories, the gong farmer's apprentice became not a boy, but a ghost, a warning, a lesson, a name whispered by other apprentices when the nights grew too long and the darkness too thick. As the towns expanded and sanitation slowly crept into urban planning centuries later, these apprentices were erased from the records, their toil buried beneath brick and stone, their memories flushed away like the waste they once handled. But in their time, they were the silent guardians of the city's health, unsung and unseen, scraping and scooping beneath the cobblestones while the world above went on in blissful ignorance. And in the deep silence of the pits, where only the drip of filth echoed like a distant drum, the apprentice learned the brutal truth of his existence, that some labors, though revolting, were essential, and that dignity, though denied by others, could still be preserved in one's own heart, even if buried beneath 1,000 layers of muck and shame. And so, as one boy heaved his last bucket up in the light of day and wiped his filthy hands on a tunic already soaked in grime, the city breathed a little easier, unaware, uncaring, and unchanged. Now, let us follow another path into the shadows, where yet another soul endured the miseries of labor in the medieval age. For the next cruel profession was one where danger hung not from beneath the feet, but overhead, from the brittle rafters of broken buildings and crumbling stone. The wooden wheels creaked beneath the weight of a cart, its axle groaning in quiet protest as it trundled slowly through the rutted dirt path just beyond the outer edge of the village. It was neither the merchant's colorful wagon nor the nobleman's polished carriage, but a bleak and splintering structure lined crudely with damp straw, the kind of transport used not for goods or dignitaries, but for the sick, the wounded, and the shunned. Behind it walked a figure bent not just by age or exertion, but by the emotional gravity of his burden, the leper shepherd, whose duties belonged not to the living village but to diseased shadows that lurked along its margins. This was no shepherd's sheep or cattle, but people, the forgotten and rotting bodies of those cursed by leprosy, bundled up in rags, their faces disfigured, their voices hoarse from disuse or pain, and their souls marked more by isolation than any sin. In the medieval world, leprosy, or Hansen's disease as it's now known, was one of the most feared conditions, a slow-moving plague that devoured flesh and dignity alike. Unlike the explosive terrors of the Black Death, leprosy crept. It numbed, deformed, and disfigured over time, taking away the senses before life itself. The afflicted were exiled to fringes of society, and the Church, with its firm grip on the era's moral compass, often declared her condition as a form of divine punishment, a visible, grotesque reminder of inner corruption or ancestral sin. And so, they were cast out, made to live in leper colonies, remote sanctuaries bordered more by fear than fences, where they might live and die out of sight of clean. The leper shepherd, then, held a job that no one else would take, and few dared to speak of. His duty was to guide the sick into these lonely settlements, care for them with what few resources the church or nobility would spare, and bury those who succumbed to the disease, which in time was nearly everyone. His hands were wrapped not just in cloth to protect against infection, but also to give the illusion of safety to others. For no one truly knew whether the illness was airborne, touchborne, or sent by the heavens through invisible judgment. Even physicians were divided, and so the shepherd became a kind of buffer, a living barrier between the healthy and the decaying. He was often chosen from among those who had already lost something, a widow with no family, a monk with vow of service, or a criminal given this fate in place of the gallows. Once appointed, the leper shepherd would don the uniform of the condemned, often a long, gray or brown tunic, a cowl pulled low over his face, and a wooden clapper or bell tied his belt, not to announce his own approach, but to warn others of the approach of his charges. His voice was rarely heard. Instead, his duties were carried out in silence, speaking only when necessary and never at length. Words, after all, could not comfort the slowly dying, nor mend the social walls built so high around them. Each morning, he rose with a light, stepping through the crooked wooden gate that marked the edge of the leper colony. He would begin by checking on the sick, some lying in straw-lined huts with bandaged limbs, others seated by fire pits they lacked the energy to stoke. Meals, when available, consisted of porridge or thick bread, often stale and carried in from afar by those too afraid to draw close. The shepherd would distribute what little there was, washing sores with wine or brine when he had it, and speaking soft words from the Psalms when someone drifted near death. There were no cures, no real hope, only the numbing rhythm of routine, which dulled the fear just enough to keep going. And yet, amid this bleakness, the leper shepherd often bore witness to something others never did, a kind of raw, unfiltered humanity. Stripped of vanity, stripped of ambition, those afflicted by the disease clung to life in its purest form, not because of what they could gain, but because it was life. They sang to themselves in cracked voices, shared their crust with those worse off, and spoke tenderly of dreams they once held. The shepherd, watching all this, began to see not monsters or outcasts, but people, scared, scarred, but still deeply human. In this quiet hell, he was their only tether to the outside world, and in return, they gave him a strange kind of reverence, like a priest and a warden wrapped into one. Still, the toll of this work was severe. The leper shepherd was often celibate, by choice or decree, for no one wished to marry one who mingled with the diseased. Children learned to avoid his gaze. Parents whisper when he passed. His food was left at his doorstep, his wages meager if paid at all. On festival days, while others danced or feasted, he sat alone in a hut, his only company the smell of oil lamps and the gentle wheeze of a patient's shallow breath. Yet he remained, not out of ambition, for there was no glory here, but out of duty, or perhaps a sense of mercy that few could understand. When someone died, and they did often, it was a shepherd who prepared the body. He washed the sunken limbs, wrapped them in cloth, and carried them to the shallow graves dug just beyond the colony's edge. He buried them with no fanfare, no bell tolls or family rites, but sometimes with a soft prayer, whispered to God who rarely seemed to listen. And when he returned, it was not a rest, but a care again for the living, who still waited, still hoped, even if only for one more sunrise. As night fell on one such day, the shepherd sat beside the fire, the flames casting long shadows across the cracked walls of the chapel he used as a makeshift infirmary. He looked down at his hands, scarred from years of toil, and wondered, not for the first time, whether he too would one day wake with numbness in his fingers or a sore that would not heal. But he knew that if that time came, he would remain. There was no one else. And so he leaned back, letting the sound of the wind through the trees carry him into the darkness of sleep. But beyond the leper colonies, far from the silent suffering of the afflicted, there existed another kind of medieval hardship, not one of disease, but of pure, back-breaking toil. And so, while the leper shepherd drifted into uneasy rest, another figure prepared to face the grim weight of dawn. As the fog of another restless dawn clung low to the earth, and weary townspeople shuffled to their stations with breath steaming from cracked lips, there was one figure who rarely walked with dignity or delight. He did not wear fine wool, or even rough linen, nor did his fingers ever escape the sting of icy lye or scalding ammonia. This was a fuller, a man entrusted with the unenviable task of cleansing cloth, removing grease from raw wool, and beating it into softness, often by trampling it underfoot in a solution most unholy. Of all the many difficult tasks in medieval society, few matched the fullers in sheer physical degradation, and fewer still came with the same pungent, eye-watering reality. In a world before the gentle hum of machines or the quiet whirl of automated laundries, the fuller served as a linchpin of textile refinement. Without him, fine woolen garments would remain greasy and stiff, clinging with the oils of sheep and the detritus of field and flock. But his method of purification was far from clean. It began in dark, narrow workshops, or sometimes in open courtyards ringed with stone channels, where barrels and basins awaited like wide mouths to consume the raw material of his labor. Into these vats he would pour stale urine, collected from chamber pots, streets, or donated by those who were paid to relieve themselves for the purpose. This was not a poetic metaphor. Urine, with its rich supply of ammonia, served as the primary agent for degreasing wool. It softened the fibers, broke down the oils, and rendered the cloth more pliable. The fuller would step into this acrid soup barefoot, or in worn leather boots, soaked through with months of work, and begin the process of stomping. Up and down, hour after hour, as steam rose around him, and the smell clung to every hair, every nail, every pore. There was no escaping it. A fuller smelled like his job. No matter how much he washed, assuming he had water clean enough to spare for bathing, the scent remained. Children would hold their noses. Merchants would step aside. Dogs might follow him, curious about the potent aroma. His presence was a social warning. Here comes a man who lives in filth to cleanse what others will wear with pride. The physical toll of the job was equally cruel. Prolonged contact with urine soap will cause sores and skin infections. His knees and ankles swell from constant trampling. His lungs, if he worked indoors, ached from breathing in ammonia-rich air in unventilated rooms. If he was lucky, he lived near a stream and could work in more open spaces, but then he contended with cold winds and water leaching into his bones. His meals were modest, if not meager, bread and boiled roots, perhaps the occasional broth if his employer was generous or his family scraped together a little extra coin. And even though his labor was indispensable to the fabric trade, he was rarely paid in kind. The cloth he helped prepare would drape noble shoulders and decorate abbot's robes, but the fuller would return home in rags. Socially, the fuller existed on the periphery, though not quite a leper or an outlaw. He was close in standing to a tanner or gravedigger, men who handled things others feared to touch, who dealt in waste and transformation, who belonged to the hidden infrastructure that supported civilization's polished front. In some towns, fullers formed guilds, gathering under creaking roofs to share resources, protect their trade, and negotiate for better wages. But even among fellow tradesmen, they were not the most respected. They were often relegated to the outer districts of town, their homes positioned downwind, their workshops marked with warning rather than welcome. And then there was the psychological burden. To spend each day surrounded by the byproduct of humanity, to submerge oneself in filth for the betterment of others, to labor without praise or recognition. It eroded a man's spirit. It bred silence and weariness, and sometimes a strange kind of defiant pride. For there was something noble, if unspoken, in enduring what others would not, in bringing softness to scratchy wool, in refining the crude into something fine, even if the process was humiliating. And perhaps that is what kept the fuller going. Not hope, not reward, but the small satisfaction of knowing that his toil had purpose, even if no one said thank you. In the evenings, when he trudged home with aching limbs and soaked leggings, he might sit near a low fire and scrape his feet with a worn cloth, rubbing oils into cracked heels, whispering to himself that tomorrow will be no worse than today. He would lie down on straw that smelled faintly of his work, pull a thin blanket to his chest, and close his eyes, not to dream of glory or gold, but to escape, if only for a while, the stink of his reality. And as the stars wheeled above the rooftops and the distant howl of wolves echoed from the forest edge, the fuller would sleep, exhausted, invisible, and entirely essential. But even in his misery, there were others whose tasks delved even deeper into darkness, whose work involved not only filth, but the raw wound of suffering, the chorus of cries and moans, the cruel theater of punishment made flesh. For now, we drift toward the realm of the executioner's apprentice, a shadowy figure who lived between mercy and death, whose hands never stayed clean, and whose nightmares were carved in bone. As the soft light of the medieval morning filtered through the rough openings in the thatch, and the distant toll of the monastery bells marked another cycle of toil and devotion, there remained one more figure whose life, often overlooked by scribes and chroniclers, was shadowed not only by hardship, but also by a strange kind of silence. The leper, condemned to a life of isolation, fear, and the eerie dignity of ritual rejection, in an age when illness was believed to be not only a physical affliction, but a punishment for sin. The leper bore the weight not just of a failing body, but a soul presumed guilty. Their job, if it could even be called that, was to exist on the fringes, sometimes tasked with ringing a bell as they walked, not as a herald of service, but a warning to all others, unclean, unclean, unclean. And yet, for all their banishment, lepers were often made responsible for maintaining the leper houses, those crude dwellings of the damned. They tended each other, cooked what little food was given to them, washed sores with trembling hands. And when one of them died, which happened often, they dug the grave and lowered the body, knowing that one day soon it would be their turn. Their labor was not paid in coin, nor rewarded with praise. It was merely endured, a quiet survival within a world that had erased their names. And sometimes, on the edge of the village, where brambles crept around forgotten pathways, you might have heard the faint clink of a wooden clapper, announcing not a worker, but a ghost still walking. And so, we arrive at the end of our long journey through bleak, demanding world of medieval labor. Not the work of lords and knights, but of dung-gatherers and gong farmers, plague buriers and treadmill walkers, leech collectors and lepers. Through each passage, we've wandered past flickering torchlight and crumbling stone, into the cold, muddy places where life was endured more than lived, and where survival itself was a full-time occupation. These were not the jobs sung about in ballads or immortalized in stained glass, but they formed the very bones of medieval society. Invisible, unthanked, and necessary. In the hush of candlelight, we've listened to their stories, the aching repetition of their lives, and perhaps, just perhaps, we've learned to feel the quiet nobility in their suffering. And now, as your thoughts grow slower, like footsteps trailing off a forgotten forest, let your breath grow deeper, softer, more even with each passing moment. Allow the sounds of that distant time to dissolve into silence of your own peaceful rest. The tools are laid down, the candles extinguished, and the long, hard day has finally come to a close. Let the world of toil slip away, as dreams take their place. Good night, gentle listener, and sleep well.